Welcome to my course, Game Development Basics, Week 8, Lesson 6, Haunted House Inventory System. In this lesson, we'll review inventory system requirements, we'll demonstrate the inventory implementation, and then I'll review that implementation. And here I am in my project. As you can see, I've made quite a bit of updates since we left off in Week 4. And one of the things that I really felt would add to this project was having an inventory system where the player could interact with items found throughout the levels. Specifically in a survival horror game, a lot of times the player can find various weapons that they could use to fend off enemies. And you can see here that I have a few items that I've placed into the level. And essentially what I want is to have the player be able to interact with those items and add them to some type of inventory storage. And when implementing something like an inventory system, there's a broad range of definitions of what that is, and it changes based upon the type of game that you're playing and what features you'd like to be included. So with a complex system like this, I think it's really important to start by laying out some requirements for yourself so that you can define the system before you start implementation. So the inventory system we're going to set up is a very basic inventory system. You could use this as the groundwork to make a much more complex system, but these are just some basic things that we're going to do that'll get the inventory system started. But again, this is not the only way to set up an inventory system, and it's by far not the most complex. The very first requirement is that the player must be able to pick up found items, and those found items must be stored in an inventory component. And we will be using an actor component for our inventory system. We also need to create an inventory UI so that players can interact with those stored items. The player must be able to equip various weapons in our game so that we can fend off enemies. And each weapon should also have a unique ammunition that is stored separately. Players must be able to use consumable items, things like health packs, or any other consumable item that you would want to include in your game. Player must be able to drop an item to make room in their inventory. And there are many other things that you can add to your inventory system if you'd like. You may want the option to move items in the inventory, to reorganize them. You may want your player to be able to equip multiple items and not just have one weapon equipped. And then depending on the game that you want to make, you may not want to have the ammunition stored as an inventory item. You may want it to be tracked separately in the inventory component. So these are some extra things that you could do in your game. What we're going to do in this lesson is we're just going to set up the basic inventory that fulfills the first 5 requirements. So let me just do a quick demonstration of the inventory system that I've created, and then I'll walk you through how to set it up. So as I said, here I am in my project, and there's some various items here in the level. I can walk up to an item, and when my interact widget goes over it, it'll actually say the name of the item that I'm going to be picking up. So here, pistol ammo, pistol, rifle, rifle ammo, and so on. If I press E, the item will disappear from the field, and then when I press I can see that that gun has been added to my inventory, and I can click on it with the left mouse button and it will equip that weapon. And you can see here that this gun currently has no ammunition. So if I scroll over this pistol ammo and pick that up, it'll be added to the ammunition for this gun, and then I can press R to reload and load up the weapon that I have equipped. Similarly, I can go to this rifle and pick that up and pick up some ammo for that. And when I open my inventory and click on the rifle, I equip the rifle and the pistol is added back to my inventory. I can pick up the shotgun and all the shotgun ammunition. And now that is in my inventory, and I can click that to equip that weapon. So let's review how all of this is working. There's quite a bit going on here, so I think the best place to start is at the beginning of the chain, and that is when we interact with the item. So here I have a blueprint class that I set up. It's called BP item, and all of the items will be a child of this class, and that way we don't have to reprogram the functionality. we've implemented the BPI interactable interface that we set up in week 4. And in this one, what we're going to do is we're going to cast to the player and get access to a component that we set up called BP inventory. And every item is going to have an item info struct. And here we can see that there's just a few variables on that struct. So we're going to take the struct from this item and we're going to pass it into BP inventory in a function called pickUpItem. Here's my BP inventory, and you can see that on begin play, we're only doing one thing, and that is just getting a reference to our player and caching that so we could use it in all of the other functions. And in BP inventory, we just have a few variables. The first one is an array of item info struct, and this will be used to keep track of all the items that the player has in their inventory. I've also set up a max inventory variable that'll set up the maximum number of inventory slots that the player can use. Here's that player variable that we're caching. And then we also have a variable called equipped item, which is of type BP weapon, and BP weapon is a child of BP item. Here is that pickup item function that we called when we picked up BP item. And this first section here is just checking to see if the item that we're picking up is already in the inventory. So we're getting our array of items and we're going through and checking that the item that we just picked up, if it's equal to anything that's already in the inventory. If it is in the inventory, we want to check, is it stackable? This is stackable variable is what allows us to pick up multiples of the same type and have a stack of them rather than having each of them take up its own inventory slot. So things like ammo or health packs, you may want to be stackable. That way they're only taking up one slot in the inventory. So if it is stackable, we'll take the quantity that already exists and we'll add it to the quantity of the item that we picked up and then set that as the new quantity of that item. And here we can see that with our pistol, we already have 11 bullets in our inventory. And when we pick up this other magazine, it'll go to 18. And we also notice that in our inventory, the bullets are only taking up one inventory slot. So if the item was not in our inventory, this would have not been set to true. So here we're going to check is in inventory, and if it's false, we'll take the item info of the item we picked up and we'll add it to this items array. And while recording this, one thing that I realized that we're never really doing is a check to see if our inventory is already full. If the player already has a full inventory, they would get some type of notification that the inventory is full and that they can't pick up any additional items. So I'm just going to create a new branch here at the beginning of pickup item. And all I'm going to do is get this array and get the length and check that it is less than our max inventory size. And if it is, we can pick it up. And if not, we won't pick it up. And you may just want to have something here that gives the player some type of warning that their inventory is full. And in the case that the player's inventory is full, we need to have the ability to drop unwanted items from the inventory. So here I can right click on an item. And then when I look down, I notice that it's been dropped back into the level and I could pick it back up again. So here in my inventory component, I have a drop item function, and it's going to take in that item info from the item in the inventory. So we're going to pass that in as part of this function. All we're going to do is get the class from that struct, and we're going to spawn actor of class. And all I've done is just get the world location of my player. Then we need to remove the item from the inventory, and that's what this function here is doing. So we're going through our items array, and we're finding if one of them has the same name as the item that we passed in at the beginning of this function. If it does, we'll just remove it from our items array. And the last thing is, we just need to refresh the inventory to show that that item has been removed from the inventory. So this is probably a good time to switch over to our widgets to talk about what's going on there. So here I have my inventory widget, and there's just a few components here. I have a text down at the bottom that just says press I to close the inventory, and we can see that on our player controller, the input action inventory is mapped to I. If the inventory is open, we'll close the inventory, and if it's not, we'll open the inventory. And open inventory just creates that widget and shows the mouse cursor and allows the player to have access to the inventory, and then sets that variable to true. Close inventory pretty much does the opposite. We're going to hide the mouse cursor, set the input mode to game only, set inventory to false, and then get that inventory widget and remove it from the screen. Now, same with other things we've done in the game. You could just have the inventory widget already there and just change the visibility of it. That's another way to go about this. It really is just whatever your personal preference is. Over on the right side, we have a vertical box, and it just contains two items. It contains a text that just says inventory, and then there's an empty vertical box called inventory rows. And this is where we're going to dynamically add widgets when we open the inventory every time. And the last element is just another vertical box on the left side, and that contains two elements, a text that says equipped weapon, and then another widget called WBP equipped item. And here in our inventory widget on event construct, we're just going to call one function, and that's refresh inventory. And this was the same function that we called when we removed an item from our inventory. And as I said, what this is going to do is it's just going to dynamically set up the inventory widgets. So the first thing we want to do is to get all of the widgets that currently exist in our VB inventory rows and get rid of them. We're going to cast to our player and set that as a reference so that we can use it in this function. And then we want to get access to that max inventory variable that we set up on our BP inventory. And we're going to set up a loop here. And the reason why there's a branch here is that we have a max inventory size that we set to 7. And we want this to create 7 elements. But our array may not contain 7 elements. So what we're doing at the beginning here is we're getting our counter, and we're checking if we are at the last index of our array. If we're not, then we'll create an inventory item widget, and we'll pass in the item info struct from our array. And we're just going to add a child to vertical box. But once we get past that last item in our array, we want to continue making widgets. So we're just going to continue to make them, but we're not going to pass any item info in, so they'll just be blank item slots. Which brings me to the next element of our inventory system, and that's the inventory item widget. And in here, we just have one element. It's a border with an image in it. Now, you could create some additional functionality for your inventory item slots. This is just the very basic functionality that I've set up so that we could have interaction with the items in our inventory. And in here, there's really just one function, and we're using the on mouse button down function. And we're going to check if we're pressing the left or right mouse button. So if it's the right mouse button, we're going to call this function up here, which is drop item, which we already reviewed. If it's not the right mouse button, meaning it's the left mouse button, the next thing we want to do is check if the item that we clicked is a weapon. If it is a weapon, we're going to call equip item. And if it's not, we're going to call a function called use item. So let's go back to our inventory component and review what these two functions do. When we call equip item, the first thing I want to do is check if there already is something in the equipped item slot. This would mean that a player already is holding an item. If they are not holding an item, we'll get a true here. And what this is going to do is getting our item info that we passed in and getting the item class of that item and spawning one of those actors. And we're going to spawn it attached to the right hand socket of our player mesh. And here in my player mesh, you can see that I've created a socket on the right hand. You can create a socket on any bone of a mesh by just right clicking and saying add socket. And then you just need to name that socket. I'm getting the name of the socket that I set up and getting its location and then spawning it attached to that location. Then I'm going to get the return of that spawn actor and cast it to weapon, and I'm going to set that to our equipped item in this component. Then I'm calling attach actor to component, where the target is our equipped item and the parent is our character mesh. And we just need the socket name again, and this will allow the gun to follow the player around in the level. If you don't do it, you'll spawn it at that location, but then it'll just stay there and it won't move with the player. And depending on how you have your character set up, these variables may be different, but for mine, this is what worked. So location, snap to target, rotation, keep relative, and scale is keep world. The next thing I want to do is get the meshes on our BP item and set them to no collision. If you don't do this, it will cause issues with your character. So we want to remove collision from that actor that we set up. Then we're going to get our inventory widget, and we're going to set our equipped item to item info, and we're going to remove the item from our inventory, and then we'll call refresh inventory. Now, if we go back to the beginning, there is a situation where the player already has a weapon equipped, and in that case, we would get false here at this branch. So the only thing we need to do is get that equipped item that we already have, get the item info and current ammunition, and set members of item info, and then call pickup item on that item. Then we'll destroy actor of equipped weapon, and this will destroy that equipped item that's currently in the player's hand. And then we go back to this branch. So it's just a quick thing to get rid of that item from the player's hand and put it back in the inventory. Now on our inventory item widget, that was handling the equip item. If it's not a weapon though, we need to call use item. And this function is somewhat similar. So we're going to get that item struct and we're going to spawn an actor of that class at the player location. And then we're going to call this interface on our BP item called item clicked, and then destroy the actor that we spawned. And this may not be the best way to do it. There may be a better implementation, but I found that this works because it may seem a little bit strange that you're spawning an actor of BP item into the world and then destroying it. But I found that this method works really well because it allows you to have access to the functions on BP item, which means each item can handle its own unique functionality when we call item clicked. And an example of this is this item that I created called BP Health Pack. It's a child of BP item. And if we look at this event item clicked here, what we're doing is we're getting the player, and if the current health is less than max health, then we'll set health to max on our BP health component, and then we'll call a function on our BP inventory called consume item, which just basically gets rid of that item from the inventory and then refreshes the inventory widget. So that's a brief rundown of how our inventory system is working. We can go through the level and we can pick up various items. And then we can open the inventory widget and we can click these various items and equip them to our player. But we can also fire these weapons by pressing the left mouse button when the weapon is equipped. And we can see that each of these weapons has its own firing functionality. So I wanted to go over a few other things that I implemented into this project that have to deal with firing the weapon. I have an input action called fire that's set up to my left mouse button. And the first thing I'm going to check is that the inventory is not open. We don't want to be able to fire the weapon while the inventory is open. We also set up some sprinting behavior, and I'll show you that. It's set up to the left shift key, and when I press that, the player will move faster, and we can see that there's a stamina bar that will go down, and when it reaches 0, the player will start walking again. So I also wanted that the player couldn't sprint and fire at the same time. So if I'm sprinting and I press the left mouse button, I'll stop sprinting and go back to walk. And that's what's doing this here. So if the player is sprinting, we'll call stop sprint. But if the player is not sprinting, then what we're going to do is we're going to get that BP inventory component on our player, and we'll get the equipped item, and we want to check if it's valid. If it's not valid, we don't want to do anything. But if it is valid, we're going to call this interface fire on BP weapon. Here on BP weapon, we want to first check that we're not reloading. We don't want the player to be able to fire the weapon while they're actively reloading the weapon. We're then going to check the current ammunition of BP weapon and see that it's greater than 0. And if it's not, we're not going to fire the gun, and instead I'm just going to play a trigger sound that gives the player an indication that the weapon is empty. My gun has 11 rounds, and when I fire them all, and the weapon is empty, I'll get a clicking sound that lets the player know that the weapon is empty. Then we're gonna get a reference to player and the camera, and this is just a line trace function that we've done before. We use this to set up the interact component. So we're gonna get the location of the camera, and then we're gonna get the forward vector of the camera and multiply that by a range, which would be the weapon range, and this is a variable we could set on each weapon. We're going to add those two numbers together, and that will be the endpoint, and the start point will be the location of the camera. And this will send a line out into the world. If that line hits something, then we want to create a muzzle flash. We're going to create a bullet impact Niagara system that we set up that will show the location that the bullet hit, and then we'll call apply damage to whatever that hit actor is. I've also set up a procedural recoil on my player, and this is what gives us that look that when I'm firing the gun is kicking back slightly in the player's hand. And you can see that when I fire the rifle, it kicks back a little bit more. We're then going to spawn a sound at location of fire weapon sound, and this will allow us to have a different sound for each gun. And then we'll take our current ammunition and we're going to decrement it. And then if that number equals 0, then we'll call reload. Now in reload, the first thing we're going to check is, does the weapon actually need to be reloaded? And this will check if the current ammunition is less than the magazine size. So if the weapon already has full ammo, we don't want to reload. The next thing we want to do is check if we actually have any ammo to reload with. So we'll get our inventory and we'll call this function called getEquippedWeaponAmmo. Really quickly, all this is doing is going through each item and finding if any of the items match our equipped item. Now, on the weapon, there's an ammo type. So if the name of that ammo type is equal to anything that is in our items array, we're going to get the quantity of that and set it to a local variable. And then that local variable is what we'll pass as the return node. If that number is greater than 0, then we will start the reload sequence. So we'll set this variable to isReloading, and then on the player mesh, we're going to play an animation montage that is the reload function, and then we'll set timer by function name, set ammo values, and the timer will be this value from our animation montage, which if we scroll over it, it says it returns the length of the animation montage in seconds. So we can play this montage and then use the length of that as the timer for this function name. And that will mean that when the animation of reloading finishes, then the ammo values will be set. Now, to set the ammo values, we need to use a little bit of math to determine how to set them based upon what the player currently has for ammunition and what is currently in the weapon. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get a reference to our inventory component, and we'll set that as a local variable so that we can use it again. We'll then set isReloading to false so that the player can fire the weapon again. We'll call getEquippedWeaponAmmo again, and we'll add that to the current ammunition of whatever was already in the weapon. The next branch we want is there enough ammo for a full magazine? So if the player has only a few bullets left, then they wouldn't reload to a complete magazine. So we're going to check if our current ammunition is greater than or equal to our magazine size. If it's not, we'll just get that value and we'll pass it as the new current ammunition, and we'll set equipped weapon ammo to 0. If we do have enough for a full magazine, we'll get this value that we set up here, and we'll subtract magazine size from that, and we'll set it to a local variable called remaining ammo. Then we're going to get our current magazine size and set it to current ammunition. And this will reload the weapon to have full ammunition. Then we want to take this local variable that we set here and pass it in to set equipped weapon ammo. Set equipped weapon ammo takes that variable that we passed in, and we're going to go through our items array and we're going to find the ammo type of our equipped weapon. And what we'll do is we'll take that variable that we pass in, we'll set it to the new quantity, and then we'll reset our array element of the index that we found back here. And this will allow us to update the ammo that's left in the inventory. And so reloading is the last item in the chain of firing a weapon. But something we glossed over really quickly was this procedural recoil function. If you find a firing animation or a recoil animation, you could do that instead. I thought it'd be fun to do it procedurally. I think procedural animations are going to become much more important in the future of Unreal Engine. And while this is a very rudimentary implementation of procedural animation, I think it's something interesting that we can go over it really quickly to round out this video. Another procedural animation that I've implemented is that when I look up or down, the player's view is going to change to make it look as though they're looking where the mouse cursor is pointing. And while this isn't perfect, as you can see when I look down like this, the player puts their arms back, which looks a little bit strange. While maybe a little bit unnatural, it is better than the player not looking at all. So here in my animation graph, I'm just going to go over those two things that we're procedurally doing. The first one is the bending of the spine when the player looks up or down. And first I'll go over the function that's going to set this variable of aim rotation, and then we'll use this aim rotation variable to set the rotation on the player's spine to make it look like they're looking up or down. So here on our update animation, I'm calling this function get aim rotation and then setting that as a value called aim rotation. And what this is doing is we're getting a reference to our player, then getting the controller and getting control rotation. And this may take a little bit of tweaking, but we're gonna get the Y pitch. And I'm using this select float node. And basically I wanna check if this Y pitch that we currently have on our control rotation is greater than or less than 180 degrees. And without this check, you'll get some strange functionality. If it's greater than 180 degrees, I want to take 360 degrees and then subtract that Y pitch, and then we'll get that as our float A. If it's less than 180 degrees, I want to get that Y pitch and just multiply it by -1. And the reason for this is because the pitches are not given in 360 degrees, it's given in 0 to 180 and then 0 to -180. So what this essentially will do is give us a consistent value whether we're looking up or down. We're then going to take that number and we're going to divide it by 3, and we'll see why we're doing this, but depending on how you're setting up your procedural animation, this may be different. Then we'll take this float and we'll make a new rotator, but we're going to pass that into the roll instead. Now here on my anim graph, we've added a little bit more. We're taking our movement, which is the animation state machine that we previously set up. And we can see that I've set up a few different ones. I've set up a walk, pistol, and rifle animation to change between the different stances. And then we need to pass that from local to a component. And this allows us to change the different bones procedurally. We're gonna get that aim rotation, and we're gonna call transform modify bone on 3 different bones. And for this mesh, I picked the neck, spine, and then spine 1. And this may be different if you're using a different mesh. I do believe all of the Mixamo assets should be the same, but if you're using the Unreal Engine mesh or a different mesh, you may need to experiment and find the bones that work best for this. And all we're doing is passing that in as the rotation. And over here, you'll also need to set some of these other values to ignore, so you're only impacting the rotation. And that functionality here is what allows us to bend the character's spine when looking up or down. You can also see here though that we have a modify bone on the right forearm and left forearm as well. And these are taking an input of translation and rotation. And we can see that that's coming from this recoil variable that we set down here. And this brings us to the procedural recoil function that we talked about when we were firing our gun. And I'll go through this fairly quickly. For this, I did follow another creator's tutorial. So I'll put a link to that video in the description of this video. So that way, if you want to do it, you can just follow his video instead. But essentially what we're doing is we're just getting some random values, and we're essentially just setting a rotation and location based upon those random values. And then we set that to a recoil transform location. And then down here, we're taking recoil and recoil transform, and we're t-interpreting between the recoil to recoil transform using get world delta seconds and an interpolation speed of 25. Now, a higher value here means it's a faster interpolation. And we're going to set that to the variable recoil. Then we're going to get recoil transform, and we're going to t-interp 2 and set those all back to the default locations. And the interpolation speed here should be a little bit slower because your body's ability to react to the recoil is going to be slower than the recoil itself. And we'll set that value to recoil transform. And that's pretty much all it takes to get this procedural recoil set up. And I know I went over that quickly, but if you would like to do it yourself, please feel free to follow the other creators' content. So I know I went over all of that fairly quickly, and there's a lot packed into this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me on my Discord. In the next video, we're going to talk about setting up some AI so that we can have some enemies in our level that we can interact with. And this will really add to the immersion and the horror aspect of our game. So I'll see you in the next lesson.